Hello and welcome to this October wrap-up. If you're new here, hi, my name's Holly. I am a book cover designer and avid reader, and I've read a lot of books in the past month. The reason being I am very busy with work at the moment and I'm spending many hours drawing, and that has meant I've had an audiobook in my ears most of the time. And when I haven't been drawing, I've been out cycling or running, and I usually have an audiobook on when I'm doing that as well. So yeah, I read 50 books in October. Some of those were very short ones, and some are books that I can't talk about because they're for work. But I'm gonna try and cover as much as I can here, and I think there are some that I didn't enjoy so much, so I'm going to try and not dwell on those too much. They just weren't for me. So we're going to start with Vladimir by Julia May Jones, and this is a sort of dark academia novel, but it's from an interesting perspective. It's from the perspective of a professor whose husband has been accused of having inappropriate relationships with his students, and it's about her perspective, how she deals with this, and how she's kind of a bit of an apologist for him. And she becomes quite obsessed with another professor in the faculty, who is a younger professor called Vladimir. And I spent a lot of this book wondering why the title was Vladimir, because he seemed like very much a side character. And then at a certain point, the plot kind of takes a turn and we spend more time with Vladimir. That's all I want to say. But this character makes some questionable choices in the course of the novel. And I think it's kind of the question of should a protagonist be an apologist for a character like her husband. And I think it becomes pretty clear later on in the book that she's not a good person, and we're not meant to root for her and really empathize with her decisions, or yes, empathize with her, but certainly not condone her decisions. So that was a very interesting read. Then I read Siren Queen by Nghi, and this is quite a bizarre book. It's set in a sort of old Hollywood times, so think Evelyn Hugo meets a kind of folkloric world where there is magic, but magic doesn't seem to have any particular structure to it. It's not sort of explained how the magic works. It's more like witches on side streets doing strange spells in exchange for money, that kind of thing. So I didn't love this. I'd hoped that I would enjoy it more than I did. But I think if you liked Evelyn Hugo and like that kind of setting, you might enjoy this for the setting, for the LGBT themes, and then it's got this kind of magic woven into it, which was interesting. I just didn't love the way it all came together. Then the next one was Sirens and Muses, another book about sirens, but not actually about mermaids. This is by Antonia Angress, and this is another campus novel. It is set at the time that I was at university, so sort of 2011, 2012, around that time of Occupy Wall Street. That's a big theme in the book, and it follows a couple of young women and their relationship through their time at college and then beyond that. And one of them, no, they're both painters, they're artists, and it's about this relationship between the art and the muse, hence the name. Again, I didn't love this. I thought it was good, and I did enjoy those kind of reflections on that time in history, very recent history, and because that's the time I was at university as well, I kind of related to that. So this was an interesting read as well. And then I read The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark. And this is one of those novels that it very much influenced a lot of campus novels that came afterwards. And I often find that when I read a book that has been very influential on some of my favorite books, when I go back and actually read that original book, I don't necessarily enjoy it all that much because I've seen how it's developed from then. So I'm more interested in sort of seeing how that book was a product of its time and then it has sort of been built upon. And I felt that a little bit with this. I enjoyed it. It's set at an all-girls school and it centers around this charismatic teacher called Miss Jean Brodie. And yeah, I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it for understanding the context of campus novels better. I hope that makes sense. The next one I wasn't a huge fan of, and this was Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. And I had quite high hopes for this because I'd heard good things about it. It's a young adult book, which can always be a bit hit and miss for me. And it's fantasy, it's queer, we've got a deaf protagonist and a trans protagonist, and I loved it for that, for the representation. That was really good. But I just felt that I should tell you what the story is about a little bit first. So it's about this kind of mythical demon that comes out of a painting, it is painted and then becomes real, and there's a mystery as the protagonist has to team up with this mythical demon creature and figure out what's going on with the mystery. I just felt it was a bit one note, a little bit shallow. I would have liked a little bit more from it in terms of the plot, given the kind of book that it was. I just think it needed a little bit more going on. Anyway, I know a lot of people love this book, so don't just take my word for it, as with any of these. But next was Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. I realise this is the first Ishiguro book I've read since The Buried Giant came out, and this reminded me that I really need to get on and read some more of his backlist, or a few of his books I haven't read yet. And it's always, I don't want to say a good time with Kazuo Ishiguro, but it's always fascinating and heart-wrenching, and he just writes these characters in the most amazing way. And so this is a kind of dystopian, but a soft dystopian, I would describe it as, in the same way that Never Let Me Go is sort of soft sci-fi. This has a world where you can buy AFs, which are artificial friends, and this is all written from the perspective of an artificial friend called Clara, and as she goes through her life, first at the shop, and then she gets sold to this family to be the companion for this young girl, and there are all sorts of strange things going on. And because of her perspective, you know, she's very much an Ishiguro unreliable narrator, and we sort of get pieces of what's going on that gradually form this bigger picture. And it certainly still leaves you with questions at the end, as Ishiguro's books usually do. And I just thought this was wonderful. It was a book that really made you think. And also considering this came out in 2021, and since then we've had a lot of AI tools come up on the market and change the landscape of the internet in a big way. Certainly in my profession as a designer, we've seen a lot of changes and a lot of worry about AI art. So it was interesting from that perspective as well, because this book did come out before all of that came along, and this is quite a different take on artificial intelligence, and I liked that from Kazuo Ishiguro. No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood was the next one. I didn't especially like this. It was slow paced, one of those books where it's very much vibes, not plot. There's a bit of plot, but not a lot. And I didn't really enjoy the vibes. I didn't enjoy the twist that the plot took, and so yeah, this wasn't for me. The same with Open Water by Caleb Azuma Nelson, which I had really high hopes for. I thought I was going to love this one, and yeah, it just something about the prose style just didn't really gel with me. I didn't enjoy it as much as I'd hoped, but I do have another one of his books, so I'm going to try that one and see if I enjoy it more. Then we had Unsettled Ground by Claire Fuller. Now, Claire Fuller for me is usually an absolute smash. Absolutely love her work. A few of her books I haven't read yet, but everything I've read from her has been fantastic. This is probably my least favourite of her books. It is about a brother and sister whose mother passes away unexpectedly, and they are kind of left in a really awkward situation in terms of their finances and where they're living, hence the title Unsettled Ground. It really is like the earth has been pulled out from underneath them, and it's how they cope with this and realise that their mother hasn't really done a great job at setting them up for life without her. But also it's interesting because the brother and sister, they're in their, I think their 40s, they're not young. So they kind of should be able to cope and work in the world, but they're just very dysfunctional, and it makes for some very interesting storytelling. So my favourite of hers is still Bitter Orange. I love that book. I'm wanting to do a reread of that before the end of the year, but this was enjoyable. But the next book was an absolute win, and oh my goodness. Okay, so I heard about this book on Books and Bowels channel, and thank you, Willow, for recommending this, because oh my goodness, I love this book so much. It is Honeybees and Distant Thunder by Riku Onda, and I read The Forest of Wool and Steel, I think that was last month, and really enjoyed that. I think if you liked that book, you would also enjoy this one. It is about, so it's translated from Japanese by Philip Gabriel, who translated a lot of Murakami's work. I think also The Forest of Wool and Steel, and the translation is wonderful. I enjoyed it was one of those books where I loved every word, but I wanted to read it quickly to find out what happens, but also I wanted to savor every word. So this book is about a piano competition, and it follows 3 main pianists who are going through this competition. And there's another one as well. We get sort of little snippets inside the heads of different performers throughout. And it's about friendship, it's about music. We get pages and pages of just beautiful descriptions of music being played. Sometimes the same piece being described as played by 3 or 4 or 5 different people, and yet it's absolutely riveting. Now, I might be a bit biased here because I did grow up playing classical music. I have that background. I'm sort of familiar with the format of a competition like this. So in some ways it was very nostalgic. But I think you'd enjoy this even if you don't know that much about classical music. But if you do, and especially if you play the piano, I think you would get a whole nother level of enjoyment out of this. And as for the descriptions of the music, because a lot of these pieces, some of them are fictional, but most of them are actual classical pieces of music. And I actually want to reread this and go and listen to the pieces as I'm playing, as I'm reading. I did know some of the pieces they were talking about, but a lot of them I couldn't sort of immediately pull the melodies into my head. So I just relied on the descriptions within the book. And I think that was the best way to go, at least for the first read of this. But I'd love to go back and reread this while listening to the music and really enjoying the descriptions alongside what they're actually describing. Although so much of this is to do with interpretation of the music. I could talk about this book for ages. But there's a particular spin that each performer puts on the piece, and it's about those interpretations and the imagery that different performances conjure up. And this is going on my favorite books of all time list for sure. I'm actually really disappointed that there isn't an audiobook version of this one yet. Hopefully there will be at some stage, because I think this is going to be a real comfort read for me. It's very sort of warm and cozy and just gives me all the warm fuzzies, while being a real page turner, because you want to find out who's going to win the competition. And I can feel myself like wanting to go back into this world, and I'd love to just be able to listen to the audiobook again and again of this one. But in the meantime, we have this lovely physical edition, and I actually drew on the edges of this because why not? It seemed appropriate. All right, I'm going to try and talk a little less about these next books. We have Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, and I'm sure you've heard about this book before. It's been all over BookTube, BookTok, Bookstagram, the rest of it. It's about a boy and a girl who meet at a hospital when they're very young. They bond over their love of video games, and then they meet later in life, when they're at university, I believe, is when they meet up again, and we see their friendship throughout their life, basically. And they set up a video game company, so a lot of the plot is to do with them creating these games together, and the sort of creative differences and similarities that they have in many ways. And I haven't heard anyone else make this comparison, but it kind of reminded me of A Little Life. I think the reason it hasn't been compared to A Little Life, because tonally it's very, very different. This is much more optimistic. There are sad things that happen, but it's not like all the pain all the time, like A Little Life is. But the fact that you're following these characters, two characters, and then there's another character as well who comes in a little bit later, and you're following their friendship throughout their lives in the same way that A Little Life does. And I really enjoyed that. It's been described as a wonderful description or a portrayal of friendship, and I think that's absolutely accurate. Then we had Mrs. March by Virginia Fito, which is about a sort of housewife in the 1950s who is kind of slowly losing her mind, maybe not so slowly. Her husband is a novelist, and she hasn't read his book, but one day she hears about what somebody else has said about the book, and they assume that the main character is based on Mrs. March. And that sort of leads into this spiral of paranoia, even though she doesn't go and read the book. She goes and reads bits of it, and the main character is a sex worker, and just everyone seems to assume, or Mrs. March assumes that everyone else thinks that it's based on her, based on this one remark. And as a very anxious person, I could really relate to that, because that's probably exactly what I would do as well. When one little comment gets to you and it turns the way you think completely on its head. And yeah, that was very, very relatable. Anyway, and we have Magic for Liars by Sarah Gailey. And this is, it's a mystery, like a whodunit type story where the detective is a non-magical person who goes into a magical school to solve this crime. Her sister works at the school, and we have a lot of the detective trying to convince herself, or trying to tell herself, that she doesn't mind that she doesn't have magic, when very clearly she does. This was all right. I didn't love it. It did get a little bit sort of repetitive and a little bit obvious towards the end. Interesting idea, but nothing especially innovative or new from my perspective. The Fell by Sarah Moss is the next one, which is a very short book. It is set during COVID lockdown, and it is about a woman basically who decides one day that she's had enough of being locked inside, and she goes out for a walk on the Fell, and it's about what happens from there. It's very much a interior, what's happening inside her brain, what's happening inside the minds of the people around her. And I love the kind of double meaning of the title as well, because the Fell is obviously the hill, like the moor that she goes out onto, but also she does take a fall, so that has a nice kind of double meaning there. And it's about like whether life is worth living without connection with other people when we have to be socially distanced. And so it was a very interesting read in that sense. I didn't love this one. I've definitely preferred other books by Sarah Moss, but definitely an interesting book for our times. A book that I didn't enjoy so much at the time, but I keep thinking about, is Cursed Bread by Sophie McIntosh. I read her book The Water Cure a few years back, and I seem to remember quite enjoying that. It's based on true events that happened in a small town in France in the 1950s, I want to say. And it's where the bread was supposedly poisoned, and a whole lot of people died, a whole lot of people kind of started hallucinating, and weird things started happening. So this is from the perspective of the baker's wife, and she becomes obsessed with a woman who's come into town, who's new to town. Her and her husband are, outsiders, and there's something weird going on where the new woman's husband is telling her don't eat the bread, and it's one of those books where I feel like you could read it 5 times and still not quite know what's happening. It's very sort of layered, very intricate, and very strange, but I keep thinking about it. And what I find interesting about it is that you don't find out until the end of the book, where there's an author's note, that this was based on true events. And then that got me digging into what actually happened and wanted to do a bit more reading about that. So all in all, while I didn't love it at the time I was reading it, it is one that I keep thinking about. So there's something to be said for that. Right, then we have Oligarchy by Scarlett Thomas. This is quite an unusual sort of dark academia book, I suppose, but it's about an all-girls school filled with very overprivileged daughters of oligarchs and very important people, hence the title Oligarchy. And it's got a lot to do with eating disorders and very disordered eating. The girls sort of, there are almost these waves of hysteria that go through the school where they will all decide to stop eating for a while, and then they'll start eating again, and it's clearly very unhealthy, but the way that the school deals with it is even less healthy, because the school decides to bring in another woman who has recovered from an eating disorder to come and talk to the girls about it, and it's very clear as soon as she turns up that she has not recovered, and she starts sort of teaching them about all the bad things that they can do to lose weight. And so it's very much about like women's bodies and young girls' bodies, so that was very relatable. And yeah, I thought I really enjoyed this one. It was quite a different take on the whole kind of dark academia setting, and in some ways it's quite funny, but in a very dark way. So yes, definitely look at the trigger warnings for this one if you want to read it, but I thought this was really good. Next is Broken is Beautiful by Jane Shearer, a book cover that I designed, and I saw that there was an audiobook now available for this, so I thought I would read it. I didn't have a chance to read it at the time, but this is about a woman who is obsessed with broken things. She lived through the Christchurch earthquakes in New Zealand, and everything around her is sort of crumbling in some way or another. The house that she has inherited from her grandmother needs a lot of repairs done to it. She's in a lot of debt because of the repairs that have been made, and she is surrounded by broken things because she wants to fix them, and that's also her job. But she also goes to this, the bank has told her that she has to go to this support group for Obsessives Anonymous, and she is obsessed with broken things. She meets all these other people who are obsessed with other things, and those things that they're obsessed with, whether it's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or eating plasterboard, are all to do with traumas that those characters have had in their past. And there's something very traumatic that's happened in our main character's, Julia's past as well, and so it's about sort of finding out why these people are obsessed with their different things. And then at about the halfway point, the COVID pandemic hits, and that sort of starts driving them apart, but also bringing them together in different ways, and it follows on from that. So I thought this was really enjoyable, very sort of heartfelt, and Jane Shearer is a fantastic writer. We have The Sea of Lost Girls by Carol Goodman. Now, the previous month I've read The Lake of Dead Languages by Carol Goodman, which is a dark academia. This one is also set at a school. I didn't enjoy this one as much, but it's still very good, and I want to read other books from Carol Goodman as well. She has written a lot of books that are set at schools, and they are mystery thrillers. So yeah, this was good, but not as good as the other one. I can't talk about that one at the moment. The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which I feel like I'm the last person on the planet to read this book. And it's one of those books, a little bit like when I was talking about The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, that I feel like I've read a lot of books that have come out since The Vegetarian that have obviously been influenced by it, and for that reason I didn't love this as much as I maybe would have if I'd read it earlier. Sorry, now I've got hiccups. That's not good when you're filming a video. But I think I enjoyed it. I didn't love it, and I know that this is a lot of people's favourite novel. But it was very interesting, and it was a lot sort of more dark and twisted than I expected, even though I knew it was going to be dark and twisted. So yeah, it's Vegetarian. The next one is Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. Oh, this book was marvellous. Absolutely loved it. It's about a woman, well, it's about a family. It's about some siblings. Their mother passes away, and they have to, she's left a recording for them that they listen to. And it turns out there are all these secrets that were going on that she was not that the children weren't privy to at the time. And it goes back and tells the story of her life growing up in Jamaica. Is it Jamaica? I think it's Jamaica. It's in the Caribbean anyway. And yeah, living on this island. One thing I loved about this was that the mother was a competitive swimmer, and she would do these long swims in the ocean as well, even though she wasn't supposed to do that. It was her and her friend, and that's sort of a thread that goes throughout the story. And being a swimmer myself, loving swimming, I really enjoyed that part of it. That was quite unexpected. I didn't think that was going to be something in this book. And the other thread that goes through this is the black cake itself, the recipe that the mother makes, and there are a lot of sort of rituals around this cake, and sharing it, especially at weddings, and then keeping some of it to have on the first wedding anniversary. And so it's kind of thread throughout time. And yeah, all these secrets that are going on in the past. I absolutely loved this book and would highly recommend it. This came out last year, so probably a lot of people have talked about it, but it was great. Right, something a bit different. Please Do Not Touch This Exhibit by Jen Campbell, which is, I had a copy of this, but I've not brought it through with me, so I'll put a picture up here. This is Jen's latest poetry collection. I was a little bit worried that I wasn't going to enjoy this collection so much, because it's about her experience going through IVF, and obviously that has a lot to do with motherhood and, you know, trying to get pregnant. Pregnancy is something I don't especially enjoy reading about. It can make me quite anxious at times as somebody who doesn't want kids, and the idea of being pregnant really freaks me out. But this was beautiful. I mean, I enjoyed this as much as I've enjoyed any of Jen's other collections, and yeah, just the imagery that she conjures up in these poems is extraordinary. So love that. Again, for something very different, we have Tender Is the Flesh by Agustina Bazterrica. Yeah, this is translated from Spanish, hence my struggles with the pronunciation there. This is a book where there's been a pandemic that has wiped out a lot of the world's animals, basically the world's animals that are able to be eaten and domesticated and around humans. So people still wanting meat have decided to start farming humans. Yeah, what a premise. This is very dark and twisted, as you would expect from a premise like that. And I don't know if I enjoyed this book, but it was fascinating. There are some really gruesome descriptions, like quite clinical descriptions of the meat processing factories and the conditions in which some of these humans are kept in. So it's really, it's horrifying, absolutely horrifying. And the main character works at one of these factories, and one day he ends up with looking after this woman who is a woman who has been bred for human flesh, and it's about what happens from there, and he has to sort of keep her secret, keep her safe, and he starts to have a relationship with her, even though she has had no education, she has no language, she has been raised like an animal, so hence the quotation marks around relationship. Yeah, this book is really messed up, but very cleverly done. I didn't realise until I'd a few weeks after I'd finished reading it that this is actually written by a woman, and that really changed my perspective on it. I don't know if that should have changed my perspective on it that much, but I think if it had been written by a man, it would feel even more uncomfortable, and that's what I felt with it. But then in some ways it has more of a Margaret Atwood-esque type feeling to it, knowing that it's written by a woman. So I don't know, let me know in the comments what you think. If a book is written by a man versus a woman, does that change the way that you think about it? Obviously that's dependent on the book, but in the case of a book like this, where there's a lot of violence towards women as well, yeah, I just thought that was really interesting, the way that my perspective changed on that. All right, The Bandit Queens by Perini Schroff. Fantastic book. I really loved this. This was, I listened to the audiobook, and it is about a woman in India who everyone thinks has killed her husband, and she didn't actually kill her husband, but she doesn't do anything to dissuade the rumours that she did. She was never obviously prosecuted for this, but everyone thinks that she did this thing. Everyone seems to be a bit scared of her, and then one day a woman comes to her and says, my husband is really abusive and awful, can you help me get rid of him? And that is the beginning of a spiral, because other women in the community who also have awful husbands come to her and say, can you help me out? So it's about this sort of bizarre sisterhood that these women have, and the relationships between all of them, and the weird hijinks that they get up to in the process of trying to get rid of these awful men. Absolutely brilliant premise, absolutely brilliantly executed, mind the pun. And yeah, I thought this was fabulous, would highly recommend. What I wouldn't recommend so much, at least in the format that I read it, is Demon in the Wood by Leigh Bardugo. This is a Shadow and Bone novella. Okay, I'm not quite sure how to describe this, because it's a novella, it's a short story set before the events of Shadow and Bone. So it's about the main villain of those stories. It's a graphic novel, but it was made into a novella audiobook. And I'm just not sure why. Okay, I think I know why. I think it's because they wanted Ben Barnes, who plays the Darkling in the TV Netflix series, to narrate it. Which, okay, fair enough. I get that. He has a lovely voice, but I just don't really get why this needed to be an audiobook. It's certainly not worth an Audible credit, that's for sure. But I have actually picked up the graphic novel itself, and the art in this is beautiful. I love the colour palette. It's all very sort of purpley and blue, and I'm going to reread this book in this format, and I think I'm going to enjoy it a lot more, because it wasn't a bad story. I just wondered why, having been a graphic novel, they made it into this audio thing. Interesting choice. Anyway, then we have Pizza Girl by Jean Kwang Fraser, and this is a literary fiction book about a young pregnant woman who is working in a pizza shop. One day she becomes obsessed with an older woman who she delivers pizza to, and this woman has a younger son who has a son, obviously, he's younger, who is very particular about what he eats, and he always wants certain pickles on his pizza. So she ends up delivering the pizza regularly to this woman and becomes creepily obsessed with her and sort of forms some sort of relationship with her that sort of builds throughout the novel. And you just feel so sorry for this young girl, because she's in this situation. She's pregnant. She doesn't know what she's doing with her life. Her boyfriend seems to be a bit of a waste of space. She's just really struggling, and it manifests in various ways throughout the book, one of which is this obsession with this woman she delivers pizza to. And yeah, the way it all comes together is really interesting. So I would really recommend this one. I think it was a great read. The next one was also a really good read. It's called The Liminal Space by Jacquie McRae, and this book is a New Zealand title, but you wouldn't know it from reading it because it's set in the UK. It's set in a small town in the UK, and it centres around 4 different characters, the main one being a man who used to be a doctor and now he only prescribes books for people's ailments. So obviously he's not working as an actual medical professional. I'm pretty sure the NHS would frown upon doctors just saying, oh, you're depressed, I think you need this book here, or oh dear, you have a cough, how about this book? It's not like that. It's more books that are going to patch up holes in their hearts, put it that way. So the other 3 characters are people who have been either drawn back to this small town or are stuck in some way in this small town. And one is a woman who is stuck in an abusive relationship with her husband, and works at the library. Another man has had a bit of a mental breakdown. He went off to Oxford, but he couldn't cope on his own, so he's back in this small town. And the other one is a real estate guy who feels like he's failing at life a little bit and ends up back in this town as well. And it's a very sort of quiet book, looking at the lives of these individuals and the community around them. And I thought this was really lovely. It's the kind of book that could have been a little bit twee, but I think it came together really well, and this was excellently done. All right, and we have The Maid by Nita Prose. This is a sort of mystery thriller, but with a very different kind of narrator. I don't think it's ever actually said, but she's very much coded as being autistic. She doesn't really understand the social situations that go on around her, and she very much takes things that people say at face value. She is a maid, as the name would suggest, and she works at this hotel until one day she finds one of their regular patrons dead in his bed. And it's about how she sort of goes about solving this mystery and the ways in which she gets taken advantage of by these people around her. And it's one of those books where I guess it's kind of dramatic irony, where you, as a person who presumably functions normally in the world and can pick up on social cues, see what the other characters are doing around her, but because of the way she is, she doesn't pick up on these things. And so the interpretation is interesting. There are a lot of times where you, the reader, know more than she does as our kind of detective character. So that's really interesting. I don't know how well the representation was done in this book. I don't really have enough knowledge and framework around that to know. But I think this really reminded me of Convenience Store Woman, in that she absolutely loves her job, Molly, the maid. She takes so much pride in wearing her uniform and doing everything absolutely perfectly. You're pristine, just she takes such pride and satisfaction in that, in the same way that the main character does in Convenience Store Woman. So in that way, I thought it was excellent. One thing I didn't like about this book is that the end goes on and on and on, and you kind of think, oh yep, it's finished now, and then it will continue. It's that kind of Return of the King type of just get to the finish. But I see why this was done, and the reason why it annoyed me, I think, is because I've been reading a lot of literary fiction, and usually you're left with a whole bunch of questions at the end, like nothing's properly wrapped up, whereas with this, it's like, oh, we've got to tie up that loose end, and then, oh, just in case you wondered what happened to that person, and then what happened the next, a few months down the line, and how it all finished up. And I think because of the genre of it being a kind of mystery thriller, that makes sense. But for me personally, as a reader, I would have preferred it if it had just finished and, I could get on with the next thing. I think it was all a bit drawn out. But, that's to do with genre as well. Next few I can't talk about at the moment. But then I read She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan, which had a lot of things in it that I really enjoyed, other things that I did not enjoy. This is about a young woman, or a girl, who her brother has had this prophecy made about him that he's going to be something great. And then within the first few pages, her brother dies, and her father as well. And she, who has been kind of looked down on all her life, she goes, well, screw this, I'm gonna pretend to be my brother, and goes to the gates of this monastery and sits outside for 3 days until they let her in, kind of thing. And she goes, right, I'm going to take fate into my own hands and become the person who this prophecy was made about, and eventually becomes an emperor of China. And so it's about the Mongols versus Chinese, and that whole part of history. So there's a lot about gender in here, and that I found really interesting. The ways that she's treated differently as a woman. No, not the way she's treated differently as a woman. The way she's treated differently as a man, and the way she has to hide herself. There are only a couple of people in the end who sort of know her secret. And that was really interesting. The relationship she has with her wife, because being a man in this world, she has to have a wife, was also really interesting. What I didn't enjoy was what was quite a big part of this book, and that is the kind of the military tactics, the war stuff. And I just find that stuff extremely boring to read about. So that's a me problem, not a this book problem. But I enjoyed the gender aspects of it, and for that, I would say that's great. If you enjoy the sort of fantasy epic with military battle or war stuff, then you might really enjoy this. I won't be reading the second book, I don't think, but I do kind of want to know what happens to these characters. So we'll see. We will see. Speaking of sea, this next book is by Lisa C. It's called The Island of Sea Women, and this was a book club pick for last month. And I had never heard of this book. I'd never read any of Lisa C's books, although I was sort of vaguely familiar with her work. And this was really fascinating. It's set on the island of Jeju in Korea, and it's about women who, they're called Haenyeo women, who dive for seafood to feed, or to pay to feed their families. And I just found this fascinating, that I'd read a little bit about women who dive for seafood, like free diving for seafood, I think in Japan, in another book that I'd read, a non-fiction book. But it was really interesting because the reason, and this is all historical fact, the reason why the women ended up doing it was because they were taxed less than the men. And then it turned out that the women were actually better suited to doing this kind of work because women naturally have a higher body fat percentage that helps to keep them warm in the cold water, and their level of endurance was very high as well. And later in the book we learn about how their bodies have adapted to being in the deep water and in the cold water. So their the way their body reacts to hypothermia is quite different to a control study in a study that's done later on. So that was fascinating, so interesting. Again, I love books where swimming or being in water is a theme, and yeah, so that's kind of the backdrop. And then it's about these two women who are friends and their friendship throughout their lives, basically, and the perils of doing what they're doing. It's a very dangerous occupation. There are quite a few drownings. One happens at the very beginning of the novel, and that really affects the way that the characters go about their lives. And then towards the end it does get very brutal, because it's set during the sort of first part of the 20th century, where we have the Second World War and the occupation of Korea, and then what happens after that, and some of that does get very, very brutal, so check the trigger warnings for this one before reading. I didn't know a lot about this period in Korean history, so I thought that was really interesting as well. And yeah, just the relationship between these two women and how they sort of get torn apart in some ways throughout the story, and the way that it changes their lives. Really interesting, and really enjoyed this one. Whew, okay, next up we have a very appropriate book for the time of year. It's called House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland, and this is a young adult horror fantasy sort of mystery. It's about three sisters. We follow the youngest of the three. They're all very beautiful and strange and have interesting kind of powers over other people, and one of them goes missing, and it follows what the other two sisters do in the aftermath of that. When the three sisters were younger, something happened. They disappeared, and then they reappeared, but they came back changed. So that's kind of the framework of the story. And yeah, this is suitably dark and creepy, and yeah, I thought this was pretty jolly good for young adult fantasy, for young adult fantasy horror. It was excellent. Big Swiss by Jen Began. This is a very strange book. It's another one of those books that's really darkly funny. It's about a woman who transcribes therapy sessions. That's the one. Therapy sessions between a therapist and the patients. And she gets obsessed with this one patient who she nicknames Big Swiss. And one day, interestingly enough, this is all in the blurb, but this doesn't happen till nearly halfway through the novel, but she hears a voice. She speaks to a woman in the dog park, and she recognizes her voice, and then they sort of become friends, and this weird obsession where she knows so much more about her than Big Swiss knows about the transcriptionist. Really interesting dynamic. Very, very funny and dark and witty, and I thought this was really good. Then I read The Resemblance by Lauren Nossett. This is a kind of campus thriller mystery, but ultimately I found it a bit forgettable, so I wouldn't especially recommend that one. They're Vicious Games by Joelle Wellington. However, that was rather wonderful. It is about a young woman, a young black woman at an elite university. She wants to go to Stanford, I think, one of the Ivy Leagues, and she has a spot, but then she loses it because of something that she did, which means that she no longer has access to any of the schools that she had applied to. And then she is given this chance to become to be accepted into her school of choice again, and she gets thrown into this sort of these games that are sort of part Hunger Games, part beauty pageant. It's very strange, and the whole thing, to be honest, is a little bit ridiculous. The whole premise is a bit wild, but if you kind of just go, okay, we're gonna go with it, it's really fun. It's dark and you know, you don't kind of know what's going on for quite a bit of it, but this was, yeah, really good. I would recommend it if you enjoyed Ace of Spades. I actually thought this was better than Ace of Spades, but it does some of the same kinds of things. And even though it's sort of put down as dark academia, I wouldn't really say it is. It's more like, obviously she wants to get into her university and that's a part of it, but it's not really a campus setting. It's sort of dark academia adjacent. All right, so I reread The Incarnations by Susan Barker, which is a book that I reviewed back on this channel. It was one of my very first reviews, and I absolutely loved that book, which is why I wanted to reread it. And it's about a man who starts receiving letters in the cab of his taxi. He's a taxi driver in Beijing, and these letters tell the stories of his previous incarnations with this other person who claims to be his soulmate, and that they have gone through these various different incarnations and been involved in each other's lives in some way. And so part of it is him trying to figure out who the hell this person is and why they're sending him these letters. And the other parts are these letters, which are almost like short stories throughout the novel that give us the kind of the backstory. And I still really enjoyed this. I think I gave it 4.5 stars. I didn't give it 5 stars like I did previously, but I still think this is a really underrated book. It's got that kind of magical realism feel to it. And if you want to learn a bit about China's history as well, the different incarnations are in different times. One's a courtesan for one of the emperors. One is set during the time of the Mongol invasions. Another one is more recent, during the Cultural Revolution. So that was fascinating. And I'd forgotten quite a lot of that since I'd read it. I mean, that was back in 2015, I think. So, yeah, I think this book is really good, and I think it's a shame that it didn't get more love back then, and it doesn't ever seem to be talked about. I never hear anyone talking about this book, but I think it's really good. All right, The Exhibitionist by Charlotte Mendelsohn was an incredibly frustrating book, mostly because it's supposed to be frustrating. It's about this man around whom the world revolves. He is such a tyrant, and it's basically the perspective of the different, mostly women in his life, his daughters, his son, and his wife, mostly his wife. He's an artist. He has decided to put on this grand exhibition of his work, and he hasn't exhibited his work for a long time. Meanwhile, his wife is going through all these other things in her life. She starts up a new relationship with somebody else, a queer relationship, and she has been working on her own work, and she, at every point in her life, she seems to be blocked by her husband, who goes, oh no, but if you do that, then I can't do this. It's like he's so narrow-minded and so worried that if she does well in her career, that means that he's not doing well in his. And he is such an awful person. I haven't been so frustrated with a character like this for a long time. And I would highly recommend this book, actually. I thought it was really good. It really got a reaction out of me, that's for sure. Transcendent Kingdom by Jacquie. I know this has been out a few years. I read Homegoing back when it came out, but I hadn't got around to this one. This is about a young woman who is at university. I think she's doing her master's. She's researching the psychology of addiction with mice, and we sort of see throughout the book why she's so obsessed and interested in this topic, and it's because of the history her brother had with addiction, and it's sort of her brother's story and her relationship to her brother, and also her relationship to religion. So that's almost a bigger part of the story in some ways. It's interesting because the American cover for this, I think, better sums up the themes of the book, of religion. But the UK cover, I think, is more beautiful, and I can see why they've gone for that, as it's very appealing for one thing. It does have the poppies for the addiction side of things, and the basketball court, which is a very key element of her brother's life. But I actually think the American cover better sums up the book and its themes, although I can see why they didn't go for the kind of religious side of things for the UK audience. We have Paradise Rot by Jenny Haval. This is a sort of dark academia gothic novel with mushrooms and things rotting and falling apart. It's about a young woman who, she's Norwegian, she moves to somewhere in the UK. For some reason I picture it as St Andrews. I don't know if it is actually St Andrews. It's almost definitely not St Andrews, but it's kind of grey and dull, and just the weather is awful. So pretty typical UK. And she needs somewhere to live. She finds this place and ends up living with another woman. And this house, well, it's not a house, it's an old brewery where the walls that have been put up are just thin plasterboard. So there's very little privacy. You can hear everything, you can smell everything, you can, like, they're basically living in each other's laps. And it's, like the imagery in this is so disgusting. There's so many mentions of urine and like, things rotting, hence the name. A lot of like mentions of, like, there are apples that are rotting, that are just there in the house, and there's a mushroom that's growing in the bathroom. Sort of very phallic imagery, and a lot of allusions to Paradise Lost, as you would expect with the title. So it's this kind of queer love story in some ways, but it's very much about the grossness and the viscerality of this place and these two humans, and this guy comes in from next door and sort of throws a spanner in the works of their relationship as well. And yeah, I don't really want to say I like this book, because there were parts of it that I just like, I don't want to read that. I'm just going to sort of skim over that really disgusting imagery. But I can really respect what Jenny Haval has done with this book. It's very, very clever. The Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki. Oh, it's been a while since I've read any Ruth Ozeki, and A Tale for the Time Being is one of my favourite books of all time. I didn't love this one. It's probably my least favourite of her books. It's a very long book, for one thing. It's about a young man. He's a boy really. He's like early teens, or I think he's maybe 16. His father gets killed in an alley when he's high, and he falls asleep in an alley and he gets run over by a truck. And from this point, things in his life start talking to him, like objects. So it's about how he copes with his grief and how his mother copes with her grief. And so much of it is to do with the physical items around us and how they affect us in different ways. And because these objects talk to him, he feels very overwhelmed a lot of the time. as an anxious person, I can very much relate to that. He has this feeling like being in a really crowded space all the time where you can't really focus on any one thing. I really related to that description. And gosh, I mean, there's a lot I could say about this. It's sort of got magical realism elements to it, although it's not entirely clear what's real and what's not, and what's happening inside this character's head versus what's objectively happening. I thought that was really interesting. And now I'm talking about it, maybe I did enjoy this book more than I thought I did. There's a lot to it, and Ruth Ozeki is a fabulous writer. I can't go wrong. Although the premise of this was not as interesting to me as some of her other books, so it's probably why it took me such a long time to get to it. Anyway, the next book was quite a surprise. It's called Are You Happy Now by Hannah Jameson. This book is about a pandemic, but it's a kind of different kind of pandemic. It's one where the people who get this virus, or it's never quite clear what it is and how one contracts it, but the victims of this whatever it is they basically just sort of shut down. They become unresponsive. They don't want to stand up or do anything, and when they do, they get quite violent. And it's about these characters and how they cope with that situation. The characters, all the main characters in this were there when the first case of this happened, and it was one of their friends at a wedding. So it's about their how they deal with that throughout the time that the novel's set, which is I think a couple of years at the most. And there's this constant fear that somebody in your life is just going to stop, and then they're going to have to deal with that. And it's about the repercussions of that later on, how, because the people who get this don't die immediately. What they die from is not having enough food, not eating, not drinking, and so they just kind of waste away because they don't do it. I think they just stop. So I thought this was a real sort of hidden gem actually of a book, because I haven't heard anyone talking about it. It was published this year, and I thought this was really, really good, really heartfelt, and these characters are just going through it. And the ending. Need I say more? Read this book, it's great. Then I read Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This book was not for me. I kind of knew it was not going to be for me, but so many people have loved it and talked about it that I thought, I'll give it a go. It was free on Audible. I read this one. Then I read the beginning of the second one because I heard that the second one gets better, but I was just bored. I did not like this book. Would not recommend. I don't really get what the whole fuss is about, but each to their own. Then I read Diary of a Void by Emi Yagi, and I am aware that this is not a horror novel, but to me it read like a horror book, because I have that aforementioned fear of pregnancy. This is about a woman who one day decides she gets fed up with her colleagues at work, and she's basically just like the coffee lady. People look down on her because she's a woman. So one day she goes, oh no, I can't make coffee. It makes me feel sick because I'm pregnant. And that's the beginning of this lie that perpetuates throughout the whole novel, which is almost like a pregnancy diary, except there's no baby. And she starts going to baby Pilates and an aerobics class and all these different things. And she's talking about the size that the fetus would be. And she sort of talks about it like it's real, even though we know from the beginning that there's no baby. But then she sort of starts convincing herself that there is, and it's kind of, it gets very strange. And at one point towards the end, there's a bit that just filled me with dread. And I kind of went, oh my goodness, what is happening? Obviously I can't give any details because of spoilers, but you kind of think, how is this book going to conclude? Like, how is this going to work? How is she going to maintain this charade? And it's concluded in a very interesting way, although a few weird things happen towards the end that that's bizarre. But anyway, so I enjoyed this book. I didn't love it, and I definitely found it more terrifying than most people probably would. Mrs. S by Kay Patrick. This is a book that I had on my radar and really wanted to read for a while, but then I put it off because Jen had talked about it and said that she didn't like it. She didn't like the writing style, didn't really gel with it. And I'd heard somebody else say that they didn't like it very much either. So I'd kind of knocked it down my TBR. I'm actually disappointed that I did because I loved this book. I thought it was fantastic. It's about a new teacher at a school. She becomes obsessed with the headmaster's wife. And that's kind of the main thrust of the plot. There are some sort of subplots with some of the students and them getting up to hijinks. But the main thing is this character, lusting after this, the headmaster's wife. And I think I would have liked it if it was less clear from the outset that the main character was gay. Although most of the time in a book like this, it's not clear from the outset, but she's very sort of clear in her identity. And so there are a lot of discussions with one of the other teachers who was also gay about being a queer person in a very straight world, especially this elite boarding school. So what I really liked about this as well was the atmosphere of it. It reminded me of Call Me By Your Name in some ways, in that you've got this sort of obsessive crush from the main character, and you've also got this very hot, stifling, unseasonable heatwave British summer kind of setting. The prose is very different from Andre Ackerman, so don't go into it thinking you're going to get the kind of lyricism that you get with Call Me By Your Name. But there were a couple of parallels that struck me. I know that one of the reasons Jen didn't like this so much was because there are a lot of very short sentences, and that becomes a bit repetitive. And I listened to the audiobook of this, so I wasn't seeing the words on the page in the same way, and I think probably if I'd read it as a physical book I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much, but that it didn't bother me at all, that prose style, listening to the audiobook. And yeah, I think this is probably one of my favourites of this year. So there we go, you never do know. Then we have Excavations by Kate Myers. This is a book about 4 women who are anything from undergrad to sort of master's students doing archaeology on a site in Greece, and there is some history between some of them. They don't like each other very much, and something starts happening on the site. Things have started disappearing. One woman thinks that it's her fault, thinks that she's destroyed one of these pieces and is very upset about it. Another woman also blames her for it and is very upset about it. So there are some strange things happening, some very difficult men on the site as well, and something happens at the midpoint and they have to start working together, which is very interesting given their dynamic. So this was really fun. It was kind of a light-hearted read. It's not super serious, but it does have that kind of academia vibe to it. And I really enjoyed this. Right, 2 more books. One is Strega by Joanne Leica Holm, and this is a translated book. It was translated from the, what did it say, Swedish? Why does it never say what it was translated from? I cannot remember off the top of my head. But it is translated by Saskia Vogel. This is a kind of gothic novel, and it has a lot in common with kind of dark academia, all girls schools, because it's about a bunch of young women who go and work at this hotel, except there are no guests at this hotel, and they get taught various things about how to behave and do their jobs. So it kind of feels like a weird, creepy old boarding school in the middle of nowhere, more than a hotel. But then at one point guests do start to arrive, and that's where the plot kind of changes. To be honest, I had quite high hopes for this one. I'd heard it talked about in a favourable way, and I didn't especially enjoy it. I thought it was a bit sort of slow paced, but also it didn't really have any payoff to it. I was expecting, I think because it had more of a kind of mystery gothic feel to it, I thought that it was going to come together in a more interesting way than it did. But the next book did come together in a more interesting way, and I really enjoyed this as well. It's called Killingly by Catherine Buettner, and it has this lovely William Morris cover, which may have been one of the main reasons why I picked it up to start with. It's also been described as a bit sort of Donna Tartt, a bit kind of Sarah Waters, which I can see. I wouldn't go into this expecting Donna Tartt level prose, but this was really good. It's about a young woman who disappears, and about her friend who is, she's one of the perspectives, and also various other characters who are trying to figure out what is going on. So it's very much a mystery. It's historical fiction as well. I think it's set at the end of the 19th century. It's set in the States at around that time, and I really liked the style of this. It kind of feels a bit like reading an Edith Wharton novel, and that was really interesting, given that it's a contemporary book, came out a few months ago. And I like it when that is done well, and I think it's done well here. It's not an absolute mimic of that kind of voice, but you know, it feels like it's of that time. It's actually based on a true story of a woman who disappeared as well, and I thought the way it all tied together was really, really interesting, really well done. It's set at an all-girls school as well, and one of the main characters is studying to be a surgeon as a young woman, which is really an interesting perspective as well. So yeah, I think this one might make it onto my favourites list of the year. We will see. But this was, I listened to the audiobook actually, which was great, because you have a couple of different narrators. But the physical book is also lovely as well. It's got these like decorative edges to the beginning of each chapter. So I did rather enjoy that. It's a nice edition, and it's got this beautiful red cover with the case binding as well. So and also love the way the spot UV has been done on the dust jacket as well. So I feel like I need a glass of water now, and maybe a nap. That's a lot of books. There we have it. Those are the books that I read in October, at least most of them. As I said, some I read for work and I'm not able to talk about them. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts were on them. I'm sure some people will disagree with some of the things I've said. I know that Red Rising is a really popular book that I just didn't gel with. So, but the one that I definitely recommend the most from this month is Honeybees and Distant Thunder. I cannot recommend this book enough. I want to go back and reread it now, but I've got a huge stack of library books on my bedside table, so I need to get to those first. November's looking to be quite a busy month as well, but I think I might do some rereading. I was thinking I'd put aside a month, either November or December, to do some rereading, but it might do a bit of both, because I want to do a video on my favourite books of all time, because it's been a good few years since I did one of those and things have changed quite considerably. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you got this far, leave a little wavy emoji in the comments, so I know you made it here. And thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!